In this video I'm going to be building this fairly low budget woodworker style workbench, and there'll be free plans available for this workbench if you want to go ahead and make your own. I thought I'd quickly mention before we start the build that although I will be using some expensive woodworking tools like the table saw and the drill press, if you don't happen to have those tools at your disposal, you certainly can use just a hand drill or a plunge router for some of the procedures which you'll see in the video. So I've already started by milling up all of this timber, so now I've just got to cut it to the correct length. I'm going to be using mortise and tenon joinery on this workbench, and I'm going to start out by cutting the mortises. To cut those mortises I'm going to be using a plunge router, and I've made this really simple jig to help guide the router. All it consists of is a piece of plywood with a hole cut in the shape of a tenon, and I've also attached two fences so that I'll be able to reference it against the work. The hole has been cut oversized so that I can reference off a bushing set on the bottom of the router. Now on the feet, the mortises are actually set further in from the end, so instead of trying to rig up the second fence again, I've just removed it, and this time I'm simply going to line up the centre line on the jig with the centre line of the tenon, which I've marked like so. Next I can cut the tenons to fit into those mortises I've just cut. I've put together this very simple jig to hold the stock at the table saw while I make the cheek cuts. As I mentioned before, if you don't have a table saw, a plunge router and a suitable jig is a great way of cutting the cheeks of the tenons. And I'm just using a chisel just to take off the corners of the tenons so that they fit into the rounded mortises. Just before I glue the leg assemblies together, I'm adding a small curve as a decorative feature to the bottom of the legs. I've just clamped up this leg assembly so you can see how it will go together. To make sure that all these mortise and tenon joints remain really nice and strong, I'm going to use a technique called drawboarding, and that essentially means just driving a dowel like this all the way through the mortise and tenon joint, and that will provide further mechanical strength to the joint. I've already gone ahead and drilled through the mortises beforehand, so with this all clamped together now nice and square, I'm going to take the same brad point drill bit which I used to drill through the mortise. I'm just going to mark a hole on the tenon at each hole which I've drilled. I'm going to drill just fractionally above each of those points, and that way when the dowel is driven through the tenon it will pull the joint really tight. And so that I don't have any problems when I go to put the legs back together, I've marked each of the joints so that I can get it all back together in the same way. Now that the leg assemblies are dry, I'm cutting away the excess dowels and sanding them smooth. I've already gone ahead and cut the tenons onto the end of the stretchers which will join the two leg assemblies together. Now I've actually cut these tenons just slightly tighter than I did on the legs because I'm going to be joining these without any glue. So if we take a closer look at the legs, you can see that I've already marked the position of the tenons onto the legs, and I've gone ahead and drilled through each of the mortises to allow for a fixing bolt like this. To cut the mortises into the legs, again I'm just going to use this jig. So to drill the hole through the tenon, I've made up this little jig, and that just simply clamps to the end of the stretcher. Next up, I'm going to make these small cutouts for the nuts like you can see here. So right now I'm assembling the base of the workbench, and so I'm using these bolts through the mortise and tenon. Bolting the base of the workbench together like this means that I can take it apart should I need to. Now I can move on to the top of the workbench, and I'm just using whatever I have to hand. So I've got some MDF, some plywood, and I'll also use a top layer of melamine faced chipboard because I like filming against a white background. I'm using a flush trim bit to cut the MDF and plywood, which I just sandwiched to exactly the same size as the chipboard. Using the router again, I'm cutting a clearance on the underside of the workbench to fit a vise. Right now I'm attaching the top of the workbench to the base using 4 M10 coach screws. To cover up the different layers of MDF and plywood, I'm just screwing this edging onto the top. And to make the workbench feel a little bit more friendly, I'm chamfering all of the edges. I'm applying a polyurethane varnish finish to the workbench, and although I am using my spray gun to save myself some time, you could just apply it with a brush. Now to allow the workbench to sit flat, I'm screwing on some small wooden pads to the underside of the legs. And with the workbench back together, it's time for a few finishing touches. As you can see, I've already drilled the holes for the bench dogs. Using a 19mm Forstner bit, I start the holes off using my plunge attachment and then finish off drilling them by hand. And one final touch, I've made a couple of these little homemade bench dogs, and that's really just because the commercial ones seem far too expensive for what they are. And these bench dogs are really very simple. I've just made them so they're a nice tight fit into the hole, so I can set them at whatever height which I need, and they have this flat surface so that I can butt pieces of wood up against them. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy the video, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And once again, there are free plans available for this workbench, so you can go ahead and build your own. So I hope just before you leave, you'll take the time to like this video, as well as down in the description there are loads of links for you. You can head over to my blog channel and you can subscribe to that channel also, as well as like me over on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and all of that other stuff. Take care everyone, I'll see you next time, bye bye.